welcome to everybody. I see that Mr. Goodman's in the front row over there. Mr. Goodman, do you have a special guest today?
I do have a very special guest.
Would you be kind enough to introduce your special guest?
This is Marisa Slayton. Marisa is started, I guess, yesterday or was it today? Is the Director of Regulatory Affairs Group, and you'll be seeing quite a bit of her. She comes to us from in-house counsel at the BPU.
The New Jersey BPU. I was the Director of the Clean Energy Division.
So we are very excited. It was a long search. Seems like it was years. So they finally found the best, and we're really excited. And I think you're going to enjoy her as much as we will.
Thank you. Welcome to Staten. You can please have a seat, unless you want to give a speech.
There'll be enough speeches today.
First item on the agenda, number 2 actually, is reading of the meeting minutes of November 9th, 2017. Are there any corrections, changes, or is there a motion with respect to the minutes?
Move we adopt the minutes of November the 9th, 2017.
I second.
Now, that excitement from the meeting in Staten was so great, I couldn't go into the other more exciting introductions. If Mr. Eric Meese would stand up, please. Is he here? Eric, we all would like to welcome you. He's our new...
We have to vote on the minutes.
Okay. If you insist, the secretary's insisting we vote. So, Mr. Meese, welcome aboard. It's nice to see you. We also have a new Chavis Bianco. And welcome to you, Chavis. They told me his name rhymes with Davis. I told him I think it's more important to rhyme with famous. It's famous Chavis. Welcome aboard and best wishes. You've got a great boss and a great unit, and we very much appreciate their work. And is there, all those in favor of the motion, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Is there anybody opposed? I'm glad, nobody abstaining, it passes. Thank you. Donna. Consent agenda. Anybody want something taken off the consent agenda? Commissioner Correa.
I so move that we adopt the consent agenda.
Second.
Is there any discussion on the motion to approve the consent agenda? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries. Regular agenda. Number 1 is in the matter of the application of Suez Water, Delaware, for a general increase in rates and for a revision to its general tariff.
Yeah,
And apparently not apparently, there is a settlement. And but then there's a sort of a kink in the settlement. And for edification, we'd like to hear from eminent counsel for Suez, Mr. Clark Collins.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. My name is Clark Collins with the firm of Morris James, represent Suez Water, Delaware in this proceeding. And with me is Gary Prettyman, who's the Senior Director of Regulatory Business for Suez. Earlier in February, we were here for approval of a settlement of the phase 1 of this proceeding, which was the rate part of the proceeding. And at that time, a second phase of the proceeding was carved out, and that was called phase 2, and it was to consider the cost allocation manual and management and services agreement for Suez. The parties, after some discovery in meetings, reached a settlement agreement for phase 2. That settlement agreement essentially accepted the new cost allocation manual that Suez had adopted for its various entities, including Delaware. And the hearing examiner wrote a report recommending approval of the agreement. Added a proposed order recommending approval of the agreement, but there is a provision in the hearing examiner's report itself and in the order itself to which the company has taken exception. So it's kind of an unusual exception. We want the settlement agreement approved, and it's because of that that we've really raised this exception. It's a very narrow one, as I said. We do not take exception to approval of the settlement agreement. We take only exception to that part of the hearing examiner's report in paragraph 52, which is also incorporated in the order in paragraph 4. And we take exception to that provision, which would impose a pre-approval requirement for modifications of the cost allocation manual that Suez uses. And we took exception to that because it would actually undo a negotiated provision of the settlement agreement. And so while the hearing examiner's report and order does recommend approval of the agreement, the settlement agreement, finds it to be in the public interest, this add-on provision is one that would actually undo a part of the settlement agreement. We've outlined that in our exceptions. What the parties did in the negotiation of the settlement was actually to discuss whether there should be a pre-approval requirement or not. Suez was adamant that there is no requirement in the statute for a pre-approval requirement, and there is no rule or regulation that requires that of water utilities. The staff wanted a pre-approval requirement, and eventually the negotiation resulted in a provision in the settlement agreement that provides for Suez to make an informational filing. That is, if they're going to modify their cost allocation manual, we will come in and we will make an informational filing. The staff and the public advocate would have a period of time to review it, and if they felt that it was something that needed further commission review, they would have the opportunity to do that. That was the compromise that the parties reached and incorporated into their settlement agreement. So in the hearing examiner's report, by adding to the settlement provision a requirement that we now have to come in and get pre-approval, it undoes that negotiated compromise. So that's our exception. What we're asking the commission to do is to accept the hearing examiner's report without that add-on recommendation, accept the settlement agreement. It is in the public interest. The hearing examiner found it to be, and that's really what we've requested. That's the reason for our exception. I can go on and add any information you might have, but I think I probably said enough at this point.
Mr. Geddes?
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, staff did not take an exception to the hearing examiner's report. Staff did negotiate the agreement with the company, and let me just give you a little background context, because I do think it's important to understand where we were in phase 2 versus where we ended up with a settlement agreement. I'll be brief. Looking at all the papers on your desk, obviously I didn't bring enough today.
I'll share.
Seriously, we were confronted, staff and the other parties, with the proverbial fait accompli. The changes in the cost allocation had already been implemented by the company before staff and the other parties were aware of it. And I believe they have 9 operating companies, but they obviously are a large company and have many different centers of operation. And in order to understand, using the old cost methodology, what the impact on rates would be, my understanding is they had to go back and by hand try to determine what the actual cost would be under the old allocation system, the one that had previously been approved by the commission. The result of that analysis is that the differential was about $260,000. And so staff was in a quandary. Staff was unhappy, I think it's fair to say, that this had not been brought to them in a way that they could comment on it before it was implemented and or the commission. But they also understood that that was a decrease in rates or revenue responsibility for Delaware customers. So in that context, we tried to negotiate something that would prevent what had occurred in phase 2, i.e. not the opportunity to comment or bring to your attention a change in the cost methodology or counting or software changes. And hopefully protect the ratepayers going forward, because the one thing staff did not want to have happen was that, all right, for this particular case, the rates went down, but for the next case, using this methodology, it flips. And there's more cost responsibility to Delaware customers. And so we negotiated that this particular methodology would be approved in this case, but in the next case that they file, whenever that is, whatever methodology they use will not increase rates any more than the decrease of, I didn't say that correctly, that the $263,000 reduction in revenue responsibility would be kept in the next case, no matter what methodology they used. So those were important considerations. There's nothing in the statute that says the commission has the right to pre-approve a cost methodology. The commission has the right to approve rates. Now, in fairness to the hearing examiner, I did argue as day follows night that I thought that a change in the cost methodology would result in some impact on rates. But that is not necessarily true. Clearly, the company could change its methodology for cost accounting and not carry that over into a rate increase. And that was the distinction I believe that Mr. Collins and his client were trying to make, was, well, this may not result in a rate increase for which the commission under Section 304 would have to have prior notice and 60-day notice. So we tried to carve out an exception, if you will. We tried to, using all on board, navigate between the various pitfalls of the statute and also what the company thought was an overreach by staff. So before the settlement agreement, there was no requirement in statute that they come forward and advise us that they were changing their allocations or their cost methodology. Also, there's no requirement in statute that if they have a software change, that they have to bring it to our attention. This settlement agreement says that they have to give us at least 30 days notice, giving us time if we think there may be an impact on rates or something that may be detrimental to Delaware ratepayers, that we can bring it to your attention. So I think the settlement does a couple things along those lines. Now, speculating on what the hearing examiner said in paragraph 52, I think, and maybe I'm partially to blame for this, because I did use the word de facto rate case, which my colleague over here thought was inappropriate. I'm sure she'll speak later. That one does follow the other. And I think he has conflated the two and suggesting that in his, I think it's the last sentence, methodology can affect rates. Well, yes, it can, but there has to be another action in between the change in the cost methodology and the filing of a rate increase. And so we try to thread that rather narrow channel, and I think the settlement agreement is consistent with the statute, and we tried to make it that way. We also tried to accommodate what we thought were legitimate concerns that the company had. And so I wanted to give you a little background on why we thought the settlement agreement was in the public interest and it achieved certain things that were not in existence at the time we were faced with phase 2 of this proceeding. Thank you.
Am I to interpret that you would agree with Mr. Collins that paragraph 4, the order should be deleted?
I would agree that it is inconsistent with the settlement agreement, and therefore, yes, I would agree.
Ms. Iori?
Thank you, Chair Winslow. The public advocate was not a signatory to this settlement agreement for reasons different than what you have heard today. So I don't really have anything to add to this dispute.
Thank you, Ms. Iori.
Is it fair to say, though, that the public advocate is not opposed to the settlement agreement?
No, we do not oppose, and we do not oppose approval of the settlement agreement.
Thank you. Commissioners, any questions?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. Could the cost allocation methodology changes impact ratepayers?
They could eventually. I think one thing to be clear here is when the company made the change to its cost allocation manual, that change did not affect rates at all. The change only affected rates at the time the company subsequently brought a rate case and asked for approval of rates that included the new cost allocations. At that time, we asked the commission, in effect, in our rate filing, the staff and the public advocate, to approve the new cost allocation. So it was the time when we made our application for a change in rates. And in fact, that change in rates was to reduce the amount of expense incurred by the ratepayers of Suez, Delaware. So it was a positive development for them in terms of resulting in a lower rate because of those cost allocation changes.
Okay, 2 further questions, Mr. Chair. Is the staff, the hearing examiner's provision, going to undo the current settlement agreement, or is the concern that future compliance with this provision would yield an undue burden?
If the commissioner's report was accepted as drafted with the sentences that we've taken exception to in paragraph 52, and if the commission entered an order with paragraph 4 in it, it would undo the settlement agreement.
And will a 30-day notice about cost methodology change cause Suez any additional costs or investments which will impact rates?
No.
Okay. No further questions, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
So I'm reading order number 9117, and I think this question is for Mr. Geddes. The Commission's approval and ratification of the agreement does not authorize any Delaware public utility to amend its management and services agreement affecting the method of cost allocation, et cetera, without prior Commission approval.
Yes.
Is that the 30 days you're talking about, the informational?
Let me try to parse that a little bit. The way the settlement agreement is set up is that there's a 30-day window. And if the commission or other party wants to bring it to the commission, they can. If they decline in bringing it to the commission for your attention, then presumably it would just go into effect. So the status in this case was it had gone into effect for some period of time before it was brought forward into a rate filing. And what we're trying to do with the provision in 15 and 16 in the settlement agreement is to allow us, staff, the right to review it, and if we have concerns, to bring it to the commission so you have the opportunity to review it, comment on it before it's implemented, as it was in this case. Historically, utilities have done this differently. Some, like Delmarva, have asked in advance. They say, we're going to change our cost allocation methodology, and we want to bring those changes to you to review prior to filing those changes in another case. Other utilities have filed those things coincident with their rate filing. This one was a little different. And so that 30-day trigger for commission review would only occur if a party, upon notification of the change, brought that to your attention and asked you to take some action with regard to it.
Thank you.
May I add something,
Yes,
Commissioner Drexler? If Suez made the informational filing, which we've agreed to do as part of the settlement agreement, and neither the staff nor the public advocate took any action, that change to the cost allocation manual would take effect. It would not affect rates, though. There wouldn't be any effect on rates unless and until the company subsequently came in, made a rate application, and all of those costs, including that modification to the cost allocation manual, were laid on the table and were part of a rate proceeding, which would either be approved or not approved.
Right, understood. Thank you.
Night versus day.
Procedurally, we have the order, we have exceptions to the order, and exception to the order. So, assuming that someone's gonna place a motion on the table that consummates the agreement and deletes the well-meaning addition found in paragraph 4 of the order, would the company then withdraw its exceptions, so we don't have exceptions after the fact, so to speak?
Yes, if paragraph 4 from the proposed order was stricken, we'd be content with.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think the, right. Thank you. I got good advice from my counsel. Striking paragraph 4 of the order would be necessary. But also, paragraph 1 of the order says that the report and recommendations of the hearing examiner are adopted. And so I think that provision would have to be modified in some way. It would be okay to adopt the recommendations, and appropriate to adopt the recommendations and findings of the hearing examiner, with the exception of the offending sentence in paragraph 52. That would have to be carved out of the order as well.
Mr. Geddes?
I believe that would be an easy fix to paragraph 1, with the exception of paragraph 52 of the hearing examiner's order, and then striking paragraph 4. That would be one way to approach it.
Commissioners? Commissioner Gray?
I'm going to try, in the interest of preserving the settlement agreement, to make a motion that we adopt order number 9117 with the exception of paragraph 4. And in addition, we appropriately edit, modify paragraph 52. Is this the paragraph in the hearing examiner's report?
We're going to modify the paragraph 1, to address the
Paragraph
hearing
52.
examiner's 52.
So accepted as a revision to the.
And I second.
Is there any discussion on the motion? Is the motion clear to our secretary? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any exception? Any abstentions? Hearing none, the motion carries.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. Thank you, Mr. Collins.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Mr. Geddes. Okay, number 2 is in the matter of a technical review conference of potential rate designs for consideration by regulatory utilities. And we have Mr. Geddes here. I would just say at the outset that we have talked to, we have received a letter from Delaware Power and Light, I see Ms. Wagner has taken the seat, so I guess we're going to hear from her as well. Ms. Iwood wants to talk, so gosh, it's going to be more exciting than I expected. Mr. Geddes, will you kick this off? I'm sure.
Maybe I should defer to all the excitement since I'm going to be rather mundane. This is a request by staff. We petitioned the commission. I've never done this before, 35 years. It's the first time for everything. We petitioned to open a docket back in July, I believe it was, July 18th. The commission heard arguments on whether it was appropriate to open the docket. You decided to open the docket, and unlike the Field of Dreams, nobody came. We solicited utilities to participate in this review discussion. I believe one perhaps indicated an interest, but it was a feeling of staff that there wasn't a real need to pursue this on some global basis, and that perhaps it would be better to do it utility by utility. And based on the experience and the fact that no one seemed particularly interested in this, as the most recent petition that I allegedly wrote on November 17th states that because of lack of interest and to try to save resources, that there were other resources, to save commission resources, there were other resources outside the commission that one could review and participate in order to gain knowledge on other rate design methodologies. And so we requested that this docket be closed, and then as Mr. Goodman will be able to articulate, or Ms. Wagner, the company feels that the docket should stay open. And so I conclude where I started. We have closed dockets before, but not normally when staff has requested to open one and then turned around and tried to close it. But you know, it's 2017 and things change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Geddes. Ms. Iwood, do you want to speak now, or do you want to wait and hear from the others and then speak?
No, it probably makes more sense for me to go now, because we actually support staff's closing of this docket. As Mr. Geddes said, staff came to you in July of this year asking to open the docket, and you may recall that the DPA opposed opening the docket because, among other things, rate design issues can and should be addressed with respect to each individual utility, that a one-size-fits-all was not an appropriate approach. And as Mr. Geddes said, guess what? Nobody was interested. So staff decided to close the docket because of lack of interest, and we don't oppose that decision. But now Delmarva comes in and says it should stay open and apply only to it. They just filed rate cases in August. They could have proffered rate design proposals in those cases, but they didn't. So why do we need a separate docket to address what can and should, we argue, be addressed in a rate case? Now, I'm not suggesting that Delmarva should proffer different rate proposals now in the rate case. We would oppose that. And after what we just went through with changes, I don't think we want any more. But what I am suggesting is that no technical conference rate design for Delmarva only is needed. I point out that even though in Delmarva's last electric distribution base rate case, the Commission approved a settlement agreement requiring staff, Delmarva, the DPA, and other interested parties to convene a working group to examine prepaid electric, that still hasn't happened. And I also note that staff, Delmarva, and DPA did meet several times to discuss rate design matters, specifically demand charges for residential and small commercial customers. Those discussions did not end with any agreement among those parties for a particular rate design. So why should the Commission enter an order requiring staff and the DPA to participate in a technical conference with Delmarva when they can meet on their own? And for that reason, the DPA respectfully requests that staff's petition to close this docket be accepted. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Iwood. Mr. Goodman?
Several things I'm confused about, but if we could first address the one that's just killing me. Chair Chair, sorry, that's acting Madam Chair, but Commissioner Conway, could you please turn around your nameplate real quick, take a look at that? You haven't changed your name or anything, have you? And Mr. There we go. Now, everyone else is okay. It's just driving me crazy. I was thinking, what's wrong up here? Something's wrong.
Thank you, I never even looked that way.
Sorry, I didn't think you would. So, anyway, just thought that would be appropriate to correct. So, I first want to apologize for only having filed our letter yesterday. We didn't see the petition until it came out and was added to the agenda. So that's why we got the letter in when we did. Not saying there's anything wrong, it was just a memo from staff. I'm just saying that's why it came in the next day from us. So I apologize that it was a rushed thing for you. And again, I'm not suggesting anyone did anything wrong, just was under the circumstances, that's when we could get it to you. And I just wanted to say that when we read it, we were just a bit surprised that staff doesn't think there's interest in it, and quite frankly, a little surprised that they want to close the docket. You know, at the request of staff, we spent significant time working hard with staff. And DPA was involved, not to the same degree. Looking at one issue was demand-based rates. Would they work? Very initial kind of look, but it was significant work. We had multiple meetings with staff over the 2016 to 17 time period. There were draft papers produced. There were multiple model runs that were shared with staff and DPA and consultants. So we were very encouraged when staff brought this docket to you, asking the commission to allow staff to take a look with all utilities through a technical conference. And as I think you will recall, because I was sitting right here when that was brought before you, I was in the seat, I'm sure. And I said to you, this is wonderful. Delaware supports it 100%. We look forward to doing it. So clearly, we have a lot of interest in it. And I also learned just this morning from talking to Bill O'Brien at Chesapeake, who is not able to be here today, which is why Ms. Wagner is probably better anyways here. Because they expressed a lot of interest too. And so I'm just a little surprised when I saw that the reason for dismissing this or getting rid of it was that there's no interest, because there's a lot of interest. We remain obviously very interested, and we also, and I hope it was clear in what we submitted, that we commend staff for their work on this. I mean, there was actually some pretty impressive leadership on staff on this, the work we did with them, and that hasn't changed, and we feel very good and very happy that they've done that. But you've really only got 2 regulated utilities in the state of the type that do alternative rate designs, right? It's being done around the country in electric and in natural gas. So you got Delaware Power, electric and natural gas. We really want to do this. And you've got Chesapeake, the only other regulated energy company and the other regulated natural gas company in the state. They want to do this. So there's great interest. In fact, there's great interest among the 2 utilities this would apply to. So I think there's some confusion about whether or not utilities are interested. The ones that would do alternative rate design are very interested. And as you know, and as was in our papers, there's a huge transformation going on, probably more so in electric. But you know, and you should be actually quite proud of all the things that this commission has done, is doing, and is still working on with advanced metering. You've got a big docket going on now about changes to customer choice, and there have been changes in the past year on that. There's net energy metering, there's energy efficiency that's going to be pending before you very shortly. Wonderful things have happened with demand-side management, the whole digital communications, electrification of transportation. There are great changes happening in the industry, and that's why so many states are looking at or have implemented different types of alternative rates. And quite frankly, Chair Winslow, you yourself have been speaking about this, and I've heard about it from many people who have seen you speak about how this has to be looked at. So we thought this was really impressive, that staff was going out and leading on this. Exploring these issues through a commission-authorized docket is the right way at this point. It's so important, and it's transparency. What we have asked is that we don't just dump the docket. We agree that if there's not interest among so many of the other companies, the water companies and other utilities that you regulate, if they're not interested in exploring this, we agree 100%. We shouldn't have a big technical conference that they all come to. Or you've got your two largest utilities who are very interested, we say just don't dump the docket, just change the order and say, let's go forward and have work groups with the utilities that are interested and keep it on a docket. And then, you know, we produce a report to you, it gets filed, and the public can see it. And then you don't have any criticisms about things that are going on that the public didn't know about. As far as it potentially using commission resources, that would happen whether you had a docket or not. It doesn't change anything to have the docket. It just makes it more transparent and open. I guess I have to comment on one thing that DPA said. She commented that in the last rate case, we were supposed to have a prepaid working group that has not happened. It's happened. We've had meetings with staff. We discussed it with staff. We're working on a report to file. That's going on now. So that's a little bit of confusion there.
Where were we in that?
I don't know the answer to that. It
We
hasn't
were the
been
ones that
produced yet.
asked for that settlement.
Ms. Sawyer, I would have to address that before, because I think I was not the lawyer on that until about a month ago when you know someone. So I can address that, but that's in process. And I apologize if DPA was not aware of it.
Yet more meetings that
Right.
DPA isn't invited to.
In any event, one other thing I want to point out to the commission, and I, again, we're in kind of a rush to put our comments together, and I left out one thing that I think is another reason to go ahead and do this with just the utilities that are interested in it, and that is that there was a docket that you might recall, it was something about a merger with Exelon that ended almost 2 years ago. And there was a settlement agreement that you approved and ordered to be complied with. And paragraph 92 of that states, and I'm now quoting for the benefit of a court reporter, Delmarva Power agrees to coordinate with staff and the public advocate in workshop reviews of alternative approaches to continuing rate cases and new rate structures. So it's very consistent with that as well, and we initially thought that was kind of what was going on by opening this document. So again, we commend staff for the work they've done and the leadership they've shown in this, and we want to keep it going. And we think, as we said in our papers, the appropriate thing to do here would be to not close the docket, but just modify your order and say, move ahead with the utilities that want to do so, and the best way to do this is through an open and transparent document. We'll get a report to you at the end of the working group process by the end of next year and move forward.
Thank you, Mr. Goodman. Ms. Wagner?
Yes. I was just a little confused this morning when I saw staff's memo that said only one utility expressed interest. I did speak with Bill O'Brien, and he did say that he responded to the September 29th email indicating that Chesapeake was in favor of the docket and that we would be interested in participating. So I don't know if that got lost or...
Just point of clarification, that was the utility I was referring to in my remarks, I just said one utility. Thank you.
Okay.
I think the confusion might have been that maybe we didn't say in an email in response to that we were interested. We thought that was, I'm just guessing that maybe that's why there was only one. We made it clear when this was open that put on the record that we were very interested and supported it. So that is probably the confusion about there only being one utility, would be my guess. But we're certainly not alleging anything wrong here. Again, I want to make it clear that we've been very happy with what staff has done in starting to move forward to this document.
Thank you. Well, you know, I think that what Mr. Goodman said is correct. I mean, I've looked around the terrain and seen a lot of things going on in other dockets in other states about innovation, what's going to happen in the future, and I was very happy when I saw the staff percolate this up to the commission so we could get where we are right now. On the other hand, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. If DPA and the staff don't think they want to do it for their own reasons, I'm not sure that I want to compel them to do it. But it does seem to me there have been some sort of a communications glitch here. It seems like Delmarva didn't respond to an email. And maybe between the lines, DPA doesn't get always invited to all its meetings. On the other hand, I've seen DPA and the company sort of work together and the staff be a little surprised. So I guess the bottom line is that communications are very important. And I think that this issue is very important. And I feel pretty uncomfortable about going forward with a vote on this today, given the lack of communication between the parties. So I would prefer, since there's no rush here, to put this matter off till December and let the parties talk again. And if there's any renewed interest, then we'll consider it. If there's not, then we'll put this puppy to rest and we will follow what other states do in the future. And we'll see how well DP&A and staff and the companies involved can work together without any type of, I guess, I shouldn't say supervision because that's not accurate, but without any reporting to do to the commission anyway. So I don't know if any commissioners want to have any comments on this, but that's my thoughts.
Mr. Chair, I tend to agree with you and Mr. Goodman. When I go to some of the other conferences, what I tend to hear is that, and what concerns me is that in an era where we are trying to raise energy efficiency, which lowers volume, but we're rate charging on the basis of volume, the health of the utility becomes a very critical and important parameter. And with the electrification of transportation, if someone's going to journey from New England down to Florida and come through Delaware, how is it that they get the necessary energy for their vehicle in the future that we anticipate? And these are going to require, in my view, some very creative solutions that if we look only internal to the boundary of Delaware and say Delmarva is the only game in town that needs to bring this to us by way of a rate case, my concern is what are we missing in the way of benchmarking what other best practices look like, and what are we doing to inform the commission as well as other stakeholders about our options and those which are most appropriate for Delaware. So I tend to agree with you, Mr. Chair. I think it should be tabled today, but I think it's a very important issue to consider, not just within the boundaries of our own context, but in the boundaries of integration for those jurisdictions around us as well.
Commissioner Correa.
Staff has brought this idea to us at this docket in July. The bottom line with common sense is no one came, no one showed up. Staff is telling us to close it. There's a reason behind that, and the reason is that staff cannot have 30 dockets open hanging over their head every minute. That's what I think, because I happen to be the staff. And I still remember, if there are 30 problems pending, then I'll go nuts. And that's where I lost my hair. We don't want the staff to lose their hair.
I didn't have enough dockets.
We want them to keep their hair. There's a logic behind staff not wanting to keep the dockets open. My question for the staff and DPA is that, can it be reopened again? Will you be able to come back again in 6 months? I say now there are people who want to come to that conference, technical conference, and let us do it again. Is there a restrictions on not bringing it back? Is there? Right. So if there is no restriction to bring it back, if the staff doesn't see anyone coming to the meeting, it just doesn't. I believe that staff's logic, or I believe in the staff and their logic from that point of view.
Thank you, Commissioner Correa. Do you think if we put this matter off till December 7th, which is our next meeting, that would be...
Yeah, that's okay. No, I was just trying to explain or trying to show my thinking for the staff that's what staff thought. I'm not opposed to keeping up to December 7th.
Chair Winslow, point of clarification.
Yes, ma'am.
What exactly are we putting off until December 7th?
The request of the staff to vacate this order?
And you mean to close the docket?
Yes.
And in between now and then, what do you want us to do?
Communicate.
About?
about the issue of whether or not you all going to work on this docket or not. If you don't
Well-
want to do it, just tell them you don't want to do it.
Well, I guess that's my issue. My position on this is not going to change. I am not saying that the DPA will not work with staff and Delmarva and Chesapeake on whatever they want to talk about. We just don't think it has to be with an open docket with a provision that we provide some report to the commission at the end of it. We've already done that with Delmarva. Staff and DPA have met with Delmarva on alternative rate designs. We're not saying we won't do that. So I don't see, from the DPA's perspective, pushing this to next week, our position is not going to change. We're still going to say the docket should be closed. The parties can meet without the imprimatur of an open docket.
I agree. First of all, I anticipated you would not be changing your position. But to be frank with you, that it hadn't crossed my mind that you were going to. But there's a possibility that staff may, because of the miscommunications, decide that it's worthwhile to go forward. And if they don't, then they'll tell us, and this thing will be gone December the 7th.
Okay, so basically what you're telling me is if staff changes its mind, but the DPA doesn't, it doesn't matter what the DPA thinks.
Can we
Well,
defer the answer?
it does.
That might have been a bit blunt, but you know I'm not a shrinking violet.
It does matter what the DPA thinks. But in this particular case, I think that it's appropriate to let the Chesapeake and Delmarva, communicate with staff. After all, if you look at the number of electricity consumers in this state, Delmarva represents a great percentage of them, and also they have a good gas cost consumer part too. And Chesapeake obviously has a lot of gas consumers. So you're looking at, it might be only two in number, but you're looking at a pretty substantial group of consumers. And the staff may decide that it's worthwhile doing this. If they are convinced with your arguments, Ms. Iori, then, like I said, it'll be over December 7th.
Mr. Chair, 30 seconds, please. I come back to to two things. I think that there may be issues of scope and issues of process. What I think I've heard in this discussion is we invited a lot of folks to the party and nobody showed up. Well, that I think is people invited to the party again in the context of Delaware. I think that the concept of rate design and options is bigger than just Delaware. Mr. Geddes has a document that's in front of me that says on page 3, the same levels of information may be gained through participation in current industry and regulatory group rate design efforts. That's fine. My question to that statement would be then how does that inform this commission about the findings and who's making those findings and by what process? Is it a conference? Is it a study? But in the end of the day, the question for the commission is what are some rate designs that may turn out to be of value for us in this state and our ratepayers? Thank you.
May I ask just a quick question so I understand what you're looking for?
I don't think so. Thank you, though, Mr. Goodman. I move that we move this matter to the next docket, December 7th.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Is there any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries. Thank you all very much. Number 3, in the matter of the application of Delmarva Power and Light Company for an increase in electric base rates. Is that proposed order number 9141, Mr. Geddes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to refer to Ms. Iori. I believe that she was the one who presented the argument on the 9th, and I've asked her to lead off on this.
Thank you, Ms. Iori.
Thank you, Chair Winslow and Commissioners. I will be leading off, but I will be throwing it to Mr. Geddes shortly.
I'm going to duck.
Mr. Slater is handing out to you a couple of things that I'm going to be referring to during my argument. And that is, so we are here before you today because the parties can't agree on the proposed form of order arising out of your deliberations from the... Cannot. Agree on the proposed form of order resulting from your deliberations on November 9th. And the issue is a simple one, really. Should the proposed percentage increase that is in the public notice be stated as an increase in the distribution revenues only, or as an increase in total revenues? Now, Delmarva will tell you it should be an increase in total revenues because that's the way it's always been done, and that's the way it was done in the opening order in this case. Staff and the DPA contend that it should be stated as an increase in distribution revenues. And our reason for that is simple. To say that customers will experience a certain percentage increase in their total bills is accurate but incomplete, because the increase is not in the supply portion of their bills, which represents about 75% of their bills. It's only in the delivery portion. Now, one of the things I handed out to you was a transcript of the Commission's deliberations from the last meeting. And during those deliberations, Commissioner Gray, you stated that, quote, "I would want to stipulate that the new public notices be issued in order to communicate what the ratepayer can expect as a result of a nearly 30% increase." That's on bottom of page 210 and carrying over to the top of page 211. Now, staff and the DPA believe that the new public notice should communicate that ratepayers can expect a 12.8% increase in the distribution portion of their bills, because that is the part of the bill that is increasing as a result of this rate case, not the supply portion. Now, it's become clear to the DPA that some customers don't understand the distinction between supply and distribution. And the other documents that I handed you are a few public comments that were uploaded to Delafile yesterday. And a quick review of those comments shows that customers think the cost of their supply is increasing. Now, finally, as an aside, we're a little nonplussed that Delmarva is making such a stink about this. The opening order specifically observed that the proposed increase represented a 10.1% increase in distribution revenues, albeit in a footnote. And it is a fact that the increased revenue requirement represents a 12.8% increase in distribution rates. That is a mathematical calculation, and we don't understand Delmarva to dispute that calculation. So we have to wonder why they're objecting so strenuously. At the end of the day, this is the Commission's order and public notice. It's not staff's, it's not the DPA's, and it's not Delmarva's. If the purpose of the public notice is to be accurate and tell customers what they can expect, the Commission will approve staff and DPA's proposed form of order, because what is increasing here is distribution rates only. And now I will throw it to Mr. Geddes and see if he ducks.
I have one handout as well. This is part of the November 17th filing made by Delmarva as a result of the November 9th argument before the Commission. This is on Delafile, therefore it is.
We missed you, by the way, Mr. Geddes.
Yeah.
Well, not half as much as I missed being here. That's a little different story. I can do many things on a boat, but I can't make an airplane fly.
Why not?
So, as you know, I'm a visual person. I like things that are graphically depicted. This is a schedule that from, I love to say this name, Miss Senator Sealy, who is their rate design expert. Did I get that correct? Thank you. Originally, in the minimum filing requirements that the company put forward, they set forth in a particular schedule, Schedule C or D, D as in dog, the difference between the distribution rates and the total revenue rates. This schedule is the update that comes out of the discussions we had, which shows, again, the difference between the distribution rates, which are in yellow, and the other material, which is below. So since I don't have a yellow marker that we'll actually see, let's assume that's the line that's marked in yellow. Those are the percentages of the values that appear above it. As you can see, they're the same percentages that are in the draft notice that we propose as part of the order. And there's also a provision in there, which Delaware objects to, where the commission is saying that this should be done on a distribution basis. Everything below this line on that chart, all of this is irrelevant to this case. This case has nothing to do with that. Now, it's a nice addition, but it's nothing to do with it. This is a distribution case. Everything in the top part of that is what this case is about. Everything below this is addition. Now, if we are having public notice, as Ms. Iworia said, Commissioner Gray said, a new notice that tells ratepayers what's going on. The chairman said, well, I won't dismiss the application, but Ms. Iworia, I'll give you everything else you want. B, that's, I think, page 212. Commissioner Drexler, you said, new case, start again on page 213. That's in essence what's going on. I don't mean to argue with that, I may have misspoke. I believe you said on 213, lines 13 through 17, I think because it is so significant that I would agree that the October 18th is a start date.
Start date, but not start a new case. Start the case on a new date.
I misspoke if that's what I was trying to say. That the hearing examiner would focus, that would be the appropriate, and to start it all over. That's what I was.
Oh, okay, sorry, misspoke, meant not start the case over, not start that case over, but starting date August 18th, October 18th, which we didn't agree anyway, it was going to be determined.
I think we're on this.
Not to start from, Todd had, Mr. Goodman had talked a lot about the work that had been done by everyone, and we were talking about stacks and stacks and a lot of calculations, and starting to recalculate some of those numbers using those that same base with the correction versus starting over on a clean piece of paper was the intention was just to give more time, not to start the whole case over.
Let me back up.
Okay.
I was trying to paraphrase something that wasn't in front of me. I did not mean to say that you were suggesting start over.
Right, which
You
I
were,
wouldn't.
in essence, saying start the clock over with regard to the supplemental testimony.
Correct.
The only thing that is basically the same is the 7-month statute is continuing. And it's based on the August filing and not the October filing. In essence, what staff and the DPA are arguing, we'd like the clock to start all over for everything. You disagreed with that. You said that with respect to the supplemental, we would get additional time to review that. And that's what you stated on November 9th. My point is, Commissioner Gray, Commissioner Drexler, and the chair all indicated that this case going forward was going to be about the original filing and the supplemental filing, which is all about distribution revenues. It has nothing to do with supply revenues that the company puts below the yellow line. There are thousands of customers who do not take their supply from Delaware, and to suggest for them that the percentages at the bottom of the page are appropriate is inaccurate, because it only applies if you're taking SOS service from Delmarva. Delmarva doesn't control that. They're the agent to contract for it, but it's not their supply. This is what this case is about. It's about distribution. And why going forward should we not say, okay, these are the percentages for this particular case with a new notice that is extended based on the supplemental testimony. That's the point.
Mr. Geddes, the figure that was the error, which was in brackets, the brackets were not supposed to be there, if I recall correctly?
I'm not following you, sir.
There was an error.
A math error.
It was a
Correct.
math error. And the math error, I believe, was that there was brackets around a $6 million number or close to a $7 million number, correct?
Let's assume that's correct, yes.
Okay. Was that a distribution number, I believe?
Well, it flowed through the distribution case. It had nothing to do with total sales or supply or SOS.
Okay, that's, yes, that's what I thought. Thanks.
It's up here.
Right.
It's not down here.
Right.
Excuse me. I'm back. So I think it's an important distinction. I will take blame, personally, for how long it has taken us to get to this point. When I came back in 2010, we argued with the company about inter and intra revenues for purposes of the 15%. That was the first discussion. In the 13 case, we finally put a footnote in that said, well, on a distribution basis, this is a different percentage. We continued that same footnote in this case, but it's time to make a change. This is not fair. As we talk about customer choice and trying to open up the state for more options for third-party suppliers, this is not the direction we want to be going. We want to be going in this direction. So ratepayers know what they're paying for and what Delmarva is asking them to pay for, based on the assets that they control, not based on somebody else's assets for which they're agent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Geddes. Mr. Goodman?
Mr. Skaggs will hand over.
Skaggs.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. R.J. Skaggs, Morris Nichols Arson Tunnel, outside rate counsel for Delmarva in this case. I may.
Yes, sir.
Commissioner. Include you.
Got a lot of handouts in the
I'll
list.
give it to you. I can't wait to.
The pile's not big enough.
Thank you.
Thank you. We were quite frankly a bit surprised to see the order come out in the way it did. The first point we'd like to make is this is an order implementing this commission's decision on the motion to dismiss. That's what this is. Commission heard argument and it made a decision. When we saw that the staff was insisting to change the reporting of the increase, from the way it had been done for years, and earlier in this case, in an order that was supposed to implement this earlier decision, we were quite frankly astounded. If your memory is the same as mine, it is that the difference between distribution rates and total revenue rates was never mentioned in that hearing. It wasn't an issue before this commission. I looked in the index to the transcript for the word distribution. It doesn't appear. So this issue has not been before you, and now we're sitting here with staff and DPA telling you to put it in an order to implement an earlier decision where it was never discussed. That's a procedural issue. So if this commission, and it's up to you, if you want to start taking up brand new issues that have never been aired before a hearing examiner and facts developed and put in orders on short notice to utilities, then that is certainly up to you. But this was not addressed. And this order is supposed to be implementing that decision. And many times we've been told by staff and DPA, and rightfully so at times, that no, that shouldn't go in there. It wasn't part of the decision. But that's exactly what's happening here. So that's the first problem with what you're being asked to do today. Now, what exactly are you being asked to do today? You're being asked to change and direct. And I'll show you, if you look at, and I'm sorry for the handwriting on the top, if you look at Delmarva's proposed order, and to the right, I give you 4 pieces of paper. It says black line to show changes. It's in the upper right-hand corner. Black line, Delmarva's proposed order. And while you're looking for that, I want to say that there was a fair amount of back and forth, and there was effort here, and I think both sides gave some, to reach a consensual order so we wouldn't have to be here. But we stuck on this issue. And so here are the changes we would like and that we're asking for. And they're shown first on page 2. And a whereas clause, third whereas clause down. Is everybody with me? I'm sorry, I tend to run ahead. Okay. There is striking a 12.8 increase in annual distribution revenues. Okay, that's one change, and I'll show you the next. You'll have to go on to page 4, in the order part, instead of whereas, it's paragraph 5, where it says that it imposes a requirement to publish in a public forum an Exhibit A that discloses the increase, and at the end it says, including the revised rates, and we would strike, and the new percentage change based only on Delmarva's distribution revenues. That's not been done before. That would be a new requirement, saying no other information, just distribution rates. I'll tell you why that's important. Now, if you adopt this order, it would not be specific as to which rates. I guess it would go back to the hearing examiner to decide exactly how that notice should come out. So that's the only changes we're asking for. It's just this one issue. So to the extent we need to be here on this, let me first point your attention to the published notice as it previously went out in this case. Same case. It says at the top, published notice. And you will see a table with the rates. Those rates are based on total revenues. Now, to make clear, and I hope you understand the difference. So distribution rates is the charge just for distributing the electricity, and total rates would include the charge for the energy itself. That could come from Delmarva or for some other third-party supplier. So that's the total bill. Now, we respectfully submit, as has been done for years, consumers are at least, if not more, interested in how much their total bill is going up as opposed to just the distribution charge. So that's why it's been done that way. When people open their bill, distribution, how much is my bill going up? That's why it's been done that way. That's why Delmarva thinks that's the most important way, at least one important way, to disclose the information. So, and the point being, and we're always taught as lawyers, if somebody makes a drawing, try to use it yourself to show that it works for you too, so I can't resist.
You're going to use my color.
So the bill, the customers get includes all this. It includes all this. To say it's irrelevant isn't true. If you look at the handout that Mr. Geddes gave you, the bottom line, go down a couple lines to the next block below him, and you'll see the total increase. So it is part of the case, and it's part of what consumers look at when they decide what's my bill changing. So that was the point on why that matters and why it's informative to consumers. The second very important point is Delmarva is not against disclosing distribution rates. If you look at what the published notice earlier in this case, you'll see footnote 2 or 1 that describes, or is it 2? I'm sorry.
It's 1. It's misrepresentative 2. It should be.
There's no 2 in this one. There's 2 in the draft one.
I already had it correct.
She always has.
The application requests a 10.1% increase in Delmarva's distribution revenues. So there is disclosure that this isn't necessarily the same, and the chart says this is how it will impact your bill. So there's no attempt not to disclose, and what Delmarva would be willing to do is disclose essentially both. And what the staff and DPA are asking you to do is just disclose the one that makes it, clear about how much the distribution rise. But I think, and unfortunately, it could be driven by a desire to just produce a higher number out to consumers and create more public opposition to rate increases. That's just not appropriate from staff, because that's what happens. If you look at
You guys wouldn't have the other attitude, would you?
Not at all.
Is that possible?
just like Fox News, fair and balanced, Mr. Chair, I gotta say. But we do, but the bottom line is, and point well taken, and point well taken on that. On the other hand, the party before you here today who's willing to talk about both and disclose both is Delmarva, not staff and DPA. They just want to do the one that wouldn't show the impact to the total bill. And that was never ordered by this commission, was not part of that. If you look at the proposed notice of increase that we would like to use, or we think if you send this back, the hearing examiner would appropriately approve, would be, it shows, once again, with footnotes. And here's the other issue. When it comes to this case, look, if staff and DPA want to come in next case and from the start say, It should just be distribution rates. Make that case that it's inaccurate for thousands of people. That's a fact. That's something represented to you by Mr. Geddes. I can also represent to you that well over 90% of the customers this would be accurate for because they take the power from Delmarva, but not an alternative source. So, but if you look at the published notice and you look at the proposed notice from staff or DPA, or you can either look at the one I gave you, our proposal, and look at the crossed out part. What would happen would be, and if you take RES, residential, yeah, as an example, what was published said 10.5 million essentially, but you go over in 4.1% for the proposed increase. If you go to what you're being asked to approve today, it says 10.5, but then the number changes to 10.4. And that's the original. So there would be, before the customers, confusion because it doesn't explain any of that. And why should it be explained? Why shouldn't it just continue the way not only has been used, that staff and DPA agreed to? I'm going to say that again. Staff and DPA agreed to at the start of this case. And they want to change this midstream in an order over an argument and emotion that had nothing to do with it. This just should not happen today. And we ask either you send this back to the hearing examiner or you approve our form of notice, which gives both. Glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Skaggs.
Short response? Short?
Short.
Just factually, and I always like to go back and use my charts again. Different color? Yellow here.
I have yellow if you'd like it to.
I remember that trick with the,
It worked too.
for the record, there are 41,965 customers who do not take supply out of a total of 316,114. I did study math, but that's
Shouldn't it be a dollar sign there somewhere?
probably enough. But I don't think that's 9% of that number. Secondly, the original notice is no longer, as I actually did this a couple weeks ago, operative. I mean, it's an old notice. That's why I was trying to have that discussion with you, Commissioner. What we did is we allowed the clock to go forward on the original filing, but with respect to the new filing, we sort of started again, new notice, let's start that portion again, and I do think this is part of this is part B. And yes, is it new? Of course. But really what should happen in the perfect world is the distribution is for everybody, all 316,000 customers. So that rate increase is applicable. It's not applicable to 41,000. So the footnote now should say, these are the increase in distribution rates, but if you are taking supply on a total basis, so the footnote should flip. We're not opposed to having total and distribution costs, if that's what the company feels is appropriate. But we want the customers to know what the rates are to the extent that they are subject to the distribution rates. Now, there are very interesting things on the back of this, like artesian, and I always believe in using two sides of every page. So please don't look at the back, although I think it's all utility related. I don't think it's personal. I hope not. But this is part of the minimum filing requirements which I originally referred to in my initial comments. And you'll see that it's broken out in the last two columns as distribution and total sales. I believe that Mr. Skaggs was suggesting the company wouldn't be opposed to putting both columns on some kind of notice. I don't think that's necessary for the majority of customers that take power from, or Delmarva, I'm sorry, that don't take power from, let me rephrase. I don't think that's necessary from the distribution and from this case. However, if the company thought that it was a better comparison to have both the distribution and total then they should footnote the total and who it applies to. Because it doesn't apply to these 41,000 customers. So, yes, should this issue have come before you sooner? Absolutely. And I'll take partial responsibility for that. We should have had this discussion earlier. But in the context of a new filing or supplemental filing with a new notice, we thought it was important, given the fact that the percentages are going up, that this issue be noticed in the appropriate way. If the commission feels that other information should be in that notice, then obviously we should put that in there. But this is your notice, and it is up to you to determine what you think the best way to communicate this filing is to the various customers of Delmarva. We think more information is better than less.
Mr. Geddes, when this case was first opened up with the application and the first notice went out, was that appropriate due process notice for this application in this case?
With the footnote that we put and insisted upon in the order, I believe that it is, it was noticed, but I think it's not, how do I say this carefully? I think for the 41 customers, it was inaccurate. 41,000 customers, it was inaccurate.
Commissioner Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The way I see this is I see two different scenarios, if you will. You have the scenario of the supplier is not Delmarva, and you have the scenario where they are. I also feel that the customer, as someone already stated, is more interested in the bottom line. The question I have is, when you have a customer that is getting supply from someone else, are you able to accurately depict the total change in their utility bill?
The notice goes in the newspaper, so there's not individual notices sent where it would show each individual customer the different change. So the change in the public notice is based on total revenues and would be more accurate for the 316,000 or for the 90 or 95%, depending on whose number. We don't know whose number because it's not been before this commission before today. But no, we don't give individual notices that says to each person what the proposed increase would be based on their power supply.
So you're noticing it publicly for one scenario only, as I interpret the response. And that means that those who are getting supplied by someone other than Delmarva are not getting an accurate communication.
I think, let me try and explain that. What gets noticed, and as Mr. Skaggs has sent you up some prompts here to look at, what's being noticed is revenues, right? So it's not individual customer bills. The first notice that goes out in the case, the notice that's been filed, what we put in there is for a typical residential customer, this is the amount of dollars you could expect to see if the entire amount requested is granted. But we can't, we have 316,000 customers. So what we try and do is show for the typical residential customer. So, but with respect to what is shown on here, it is not the customer bill, it's the percentage revenue increase. And the concern is that if you change the way it's being shown halfway through, in this case, it would say that the change is going to be 12%, 12.8%, when it's really only going to be 5% of your bill. And we don't want customers to believe, oh my God, my bill's going up 12.8%, when even if the entire amount gets granted, which I haven't seen happen yet, although we wouldn't object, it would be it would only be a 5% increase. That's why it's always been shown as a percentage of total bill. And by the way, to answer what I think is the other part of your question is this. It would be almost the identical percent increase even for those on choice, and it's a lot less than 41,000. It's between 5 and 10%. 10% is 31,000. So to make it clear, it's 100% accurate for the vast majority of our customers, and it is 99.999% for those on choice. Does that help answer your question?
I think it does, and I would assume in some cases people who are taking supply from others are doing so because there's some economic savings for them. Therefore, they would get something less than the total that you would publicly display in terms of their total
Correct.
bill.
Correct.
Theoretically.
Correct.
You guys are killing me.
We're not trying to.
I know you're killing me. I mean, there was an original notice that went out, and we had a dispute that brought us here. We thought we resolved the dispute, and as far as I can recall, this issue was not part of that dispute. Maybe I'm mistaken on that, but I don't remember it. So I'm not, frankly, real agreeable with respect to this last-second change. If there's something that you want to see changed, I think it should go through the whole process with the hearing examiner and bring it up to us. I mean, we really haven't had a full occasion. I mean, we spent, what, 15, 20 minutes on this thing.
Mr. Chair, may I, please?
Yes,
Insofar as the record from the last hearing was used to reflect what I was hoping to communicate to the customer, I feel very comfortable, based on the explanation you provided, that you're showing the typical customer the total increase in their bill. I understand the position of the public advocate and staff, but under the circumstances and the undue complexity that this presents for the commission, Mr. Chair, I would like to propose, if you don't mind, and move that we adopt the Delmarva's revised order in this matter.
And I second that.
Is there any discussion on the motion? Hearing no discussion, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Are there any abstentions? The motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a mistake.
Number 4, in the matter of the application of Delmarva Power and Light Company for approval of a program for plug-in vehicle charging. Mr. Goodman.
Thank you, Your Honor. I was about to get out of this chair, and sorry. I want to thank, as usual, staff for not only putting together a draft order and sharing it with us 2 weeks ago, probably it was. And DPA had some rather extensive changes, and Gina and I discussed them, and they made sense to me. And so we made them, we agreed to them, and staff has agreed to them. So the order that you have before you today, of course, is just the order opening this docket. One of the issues you heard about earlier, electrification of transportation, and that's what we're putting before you to hopefully get it addressed in an organized manner. And we have an order that is agreed to amongst the parties, so we're very pleased with it as it stands. And again, we thank the parties for working together to get it that way.
However, good.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Willard. Mr. Goodman is right that the DPA did have extensive changes. One of those changes, however, did not make it into the proposed public notice. And that is because Delmarva does provide service in all 3 counties, we should have public comment sessions in all 3 counties. Mr. Goodman did agree with me on that, and that, I believe, was communicated back to staff, but unfortunately, it didn't make it into the public notice. So, to the extent that, I see Mr. Willard shaking his head, so.
If I may, because of that, Your Honor, the public notice attached to this order says there'll be 1 hearing in Dover, Delaware. DPA pointed out Delmarva does business throughout the state. It should be 3 public hearings in 3 different counties. The staff has now agreed, but this came up so late in the process that we're now going to have to arrange a time and a place in Sussex and Newcastle County. So we asked the commission to simply table this until next week.
And we agree 100% with DPA bringing that up.
Is there any objection from any commissioner? No. Hearing none, it's tabled until the next meeting.
Thank you. That was easier than the last one.
And I thank staff for its accommodation.
5, in the matter of the application of Chesapeake Utilities Corporation for approval of the change in its environmental rider rate.
Yes, Your Honor.
I guess we're gonna have, Mr.
Hot seat.
Yes, Chair Winslow and Commissioners,
Mr. Willard, I'm going to call on the esteemed ex-staff member and representative of Chesapeake to kick this off as a
Okay.
application. Ms. Wagner.
Okay. Before you is proposed order number 9148 to open the docket for environmental rider rate change, and also issue a form of public notice. Pursuant to the environmental remediation recovery mechanism approved in PSC order number 4104 in 1995, Chesapeake Utilities has filed an application with the Commission proposing to increase the environmental rider surcharge from 0.002 per CCF to 0.004 per CCF for all firm delivery customers. And we're requesting that you approve the proposed order.
Thank you, Ms. Wagner. Mr. Willard.
Yes, as Ms. Wagner said, it's a proposal from going from 0.0002 to 0.004 effective December 1st on a temporary basis subject to refund. This will increase the average customer's bill approximately 3 cents per month. Chesapeake's filed this application to recover remediation costs associated with a gas site in Seaford, Delaware. The order also directs the company to publish public notice of the filing and sets an intervention period of January 5th, 2018, while also designating Mr. Hay for the sole purpose of considering any intervention petitions that might be received. It also sets a hearing date directly before the Commission on February 20th, 2018. And staff recommends approval of the order by the Commission.
Ms. Iori.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Winslow. The public advocate supports the proposed form of order.
You notice today that when we talk about, in most days when we talk about increases and the commissioners ask questions, they always want to know what the dollar sign is. In this case, it's 0.03 cents versus a percentage. It's just a kind of curiosity. Anybody have any questions of Ms. Wagner? Motion?
Move we approve order number 9148 as presented.
Second the motion?
Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries. There's nothing on our hearing schedule. Thank you, Ms. Wagner. And
Thank you.
Ms. Iori and Mr. Willard. And is there anyone here from the public that wishes to make public comment to the Public Service Commission? Mr. Howell.
Chairman Winslow, Commissioners, good afternoon, late afternoon, getting later all the time, and we have a long meeting ahead of us.
Mr. Howard, I apologize, but we're going to take a 5-minute recess.
Thank you.
If you say so.
We were good. Oh, I was.
But interestingly, one of them is not in our neighborhood. So my question is. Limited budget. because those people won't be, it's a limited budget to hire.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
We do have nice ones on the side that, you know, if they're, doesn't have, we don't have a, I don't know.
This is part of our.
So, but it is expensive because it's 14 and it's over.
No, I'm here.
Well, I'm asking about Chester, so, because I am charging.
I think we're gonna schedule some time to come to the commission years with staff.
And, so we probably have a 5,000. There have been storms that we can't. But in the last couple of years, so our guy goes for that, so.
I got it.
But I am.
There she is, there she is,
Yeah.
right up.
So when we have a bad time. So I said, I can't believe that. I'm sure I can chase
So you're getting around, relax.
Well. My grandkids are fine. It can be. We try to.
Gloria, so 5 minutes up.
We filed our
We're back in session, please. Mr. Howard, I apologize for the interruption, but I can assure you that the other embarrassment would have been worse.
Chairman Winslow, Commissioners, I certainly appreciate the dilemma that you may have been in. We have one slight change under Director's comments. We have a late addition to the Director's comments, and since it was Ms. Knott's, I thought maybe you would probably not object to her sharing a little bit of information with you under Director's comments.
Good afternoon, Chairman Winslow and Commissioners.
Good afternoon.
This past Monday, Delmarva held its first tranche for the standard offer service supply contracts that begin on June 1st, 2018. And Jim Ledzelder is here from the Liberty Consulting Group to present the public results from this tranche. So I'll let him, there is a presentation if we're able to get it up to review these.
Hello and good afternoon, Chairman and Commissioners. It's always a pleasure to see you, and I'm presenting today, as Ms. Knotts mentioned, on behalf of Liberty Consulting about the Tranche 1 auctions that took place this past Monday. Slide, please. We again performed the role of technical monitor for these auctions, and to summarize, the auctions were consistent with the RFP. They were competitive in terms of both the number of participants and the actual number of bids placed and received. And they resulted in winning bids that reflect market conditions. They were a bit higher than last year's prices, but that was expected. And they're still low from a historical perspective. Slide. We performed our usual tasks, which are summarized into these 6 categories, which are to review the bidder communication channels, review the bidder website and data room materials, to oversee bidder eligibility, to confirm the fees for the use of Enernox auction platform, develop a power market assessment for staff, and monitor the auction room. All went according to plan and without a hitch. Slide. As an overview of this tranche, there were 7 blocks totaling just over 270 megawatts in this tranche. There were 3 blocks of Risky, 2 of MGS, and 1 each of LGS and GSP. Slide. This is a special note for this year. This tranche marks the first phase of a transition from a 3-year to a 2-year contract for delivery for the Risky class blocks. In order to get from 3 to 2 years, the transition requires that all Risky blocks for this year are just 1 year. Next year's 2019 RFP will use a combination of 1 and 2-year contracts, and the 2020 RFP will use all 2-year contract periods. So this year was a bit different than previous years, and it was explained to the bidders how it would work, and the change was accepted in the market as shown in the healthy participation from the suppliers that we achieved. Slide. So about participation, it was good in tranche 1. We had 6 bidders, which is the same as last year. We actually had 1 less eligible bidder this year. We had 7 versus 8 last year, but we ended up with only 6 actual bidders, which was the same as last year. And this is definitely an adequate level of participation. Okay, slide. Overall, the bid activity was even better than last year, and by bid activity I mean the number of bids that were placed. The Risky and MGS blocks had more bids, and the LGS and GSP blocks each had just 1 less bid than last year. And this is another indication of the healthiness of the competition of these auctions. Slide. Prior to the auctions, we reviewed the power markets in order to identify any market conditions that may not be conducive to a competitive auction, and also to establish opening prices for the auctions and to estimate a range of winning prices. All of these were performed and the auctions proceeded as scheduled. Slide. So to talk about the market, in our review of the market, we usually look at both the 1 and 3-year delivery periods commencing every year on June 1st. But this year's a little different because there is no 3-year term for Risky blocks. So we focused on the 1-year delivery term. We did include a longer look into the future on the chart itself, as you can see, to give a sense of the long-term outlook as the market sees it. So the red line that you see is the forward price from the most recent auction this week in terms of the energy price at the PJM Western Hub. The dashed black line is the same for tranche 2 of last January, and the solid black line is tranche 1 from a year ago. For the 1-year period, we determined that the PJM Western Hub energy prices had declined relative to both tranches of 2017. All other things equal, this would have the effect of driving bid prices lower, as you might expect. Slide. Of course, natural gas prices are the key to understanding power pricing in PJM, and gas remains at very low levels from a historical standpoint. This chart shows the relationship between gas and power in PJM, which generally rise and fall together. The chart shows that shows the Dominion Gas Hub versus the PJM Western Hub for electricity. Gas is actually trending slightly down over this 2-year period, but what the slide indicates is that with the market conditions we have, that there's a close linkage between gas and power, and that's exactly what we want to see. Slide. Now, importantly, this time around, we wanted to give a little bit more depth to our analysis and explanation of what's going on in the capacity market. In contrast to the lower wholesale energy prices that I just showed, capacity prices are up. Each of the blue bars that you see here represent a capacity price for a specific one-year delivery period that coincides with the delivery periods of the Delaware auctions. The bar on the far left represents the price for delivery in 2017 and 18. It's applicable to last year's MGS, LGS, and GSP blocks. The red line that you see is the average of all of these three blocks. It's the average of the 3 yearly capacity prices, and that average was applicable to last year's risky blocks. The middle block reflects the capacity price applicable to all blocks this year, because as you recall that I just stated, the risky blocks for this year are only 1 year in length. So for MGS, LGS, and GSP, the increase in capacity price is based on the difference between the left and middle blue bars. And as you can see, there's a substantial increase of 45% this year. For risky, we look at the difference between the red line and that middle bar, which again is a substantial increase of 36%. So for all the blocks of this auction, the capacity component was up sharply, and the large increase in capacity price outweighed the lower energy prices, explaining why bid prices are up a little bit year over year. The good news is that the 2019 and 20 capacity price that you see on the far right drops substantially year over year, about 48% year over year. And the 2020 to 21 price that is not on this is a bit higher, but is in between the 2019 and 2018 numbers. It's about 172. So this explains what's going on in the capacity market and how it has impacted the relative prices compared to last year. Slide. In conclusion, the auctions went well. They were competitive, and they resulted in winning bids that were consistent with the prevailing market conditions. Slightly up from last year, but still favorable from a historical perspective. This concludes the public version of my presentation, so I'd be happy to take any questions you have at this point. Thank you.
What were the factors that led to the higher capacity price you referred to?
Well, quite simply with that, 2015, when those prices were auctioned, was the first year of PJM's capacity performance market, and there was a risk factor built in by bidders, not understanding the market, a little fear in the market, the fact that it was new, and we saw those high prices, and then after a year to sort of digest what was going on, you see the market fell back down.
Thank you, that's what I,
Welcome.
On slide 8, you mentioned estimating the ranges of prices. Were those prices within the ranges that you estimated?
The prices that actually came out of the auction for every single one of the 7 blocks came in lower than our expectations. Higher than last year, but lower than our expectations. And that is completely attributed to the high level of competition we had. We saw some dynamics in the actual auction for each block that showed bidders just trying real hard to outbid each other. So I got the feeling that nobody left too much on the table. They really went after it. Thanks. Welcome.
Thank you, sir. It's
You're
always
welcome.
nice to see you.
Likewise.
Last time, I remember the weather wasn't quite as nice as it is today, so you have an easier trip home.
Yes, that's true.
Thank you, Mr. Ledzelder. Ms. Knotts, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's always exciting to have PJM with us. Today, we're obviously lucky enough to have Lori here with us, who's a regular at our meetings. We also have Mr. Hurling and Mr. McGlynn here. And I would welcome them to come up and present their more updated information. I believe I sent out to you a presentation that was end of year 2016, but I understand PJM has got much more recent information on their handouts.
Well, this, and the materials that you have are year-to-date as of the end of October, which, you know, as we go through it, you'll see in some cases is actually not providing you as much information as we might like. We are still working on the format of these reports. I'll start walking through the capacity information. Paul will take you through some of the transmission. There's not a lot of transmission information in here because not much is happening in Delaware in 2017, but we will fill you in on kind of the carryovers from last year, some of the projects you may have some questions on. If you look at the slides, I'll skip to slide 7 where the capacity information starts. I'm not sure this has changed a whole lot since last year. This is the capacity mix in Delaware. As you can see, a substantial portion of the capacity is natural gas, followed by oil, a little bit of coal. If you look at slide 8, that shows you the entirety of PJM, and that mix has been changing somewhat dramatically over the last few years. We've had a fair bit of coal retirement. In particular, since 2011, the end of 2011, a lot of new natural gas plants being built, in particular in the eastern part of PJM. When we get toward the end, some of the market information, you'll see, some of the congestion issues have changed dramatically over the years as a result of all the new gas that's been built. We now actually have more natural gas capacity in PJM than coal. That reversed a couple of years back. But we are still, an extremely diverse system from a fuel perspective. Roughly 1/3 natural gas, 1/3 coal, and the remaining third made up primarily of nuclear and some other fuel types. If you look at slide 9, this shows you the current activity in our generator interconnection queue. There's a couple of things you need to understand about these numbers. First of all, when it talks about megawatts of capacity, that's essentially the dependable capacity of the units, which for natural gas is the full capability of the unit. But for wind, for example, if you have a 100 megawatt wind farm on land, in the peak of the summer, that's only good for about 13 megawatts on average, so it's deeply discounted from a capacity standpoint. The 130 megawatts you see here is offshore wind off of Indian River, and therefore has a much better capacity factor than onshore wind. The 130 megawatts actually is about 500 megawatts of energy capability to two plants, roughly 250 megawatts apiece. Where you see projects described as active, that means they are in the queue and under study. We have a significant dropout rate. We've talked about this, I think, in the past. The dropout rate historically over the last 18 years has been well over 80%. So you can't take these numbers and make assumptions that all of this capacity is ultimately going to get built. Over time, a significant portion of it eventually does drop out of the queue. And you can see that on the next page. I'll get to that in a moment. You do have 148 megawatts of solar. The capacity factor for solar is fairly good in the summertime, but not quite 50%. So this 148 is probably slightly over 300 megawatts of energy capability. The natural gas, again, 742 megawatts. Most of that is well, actually, if you look at slide 10, it's easier to see. There is a typo on slide 9 where it says under construction 7 megawatts. That should be 291, and we'll get that fixed. I apologize for that. If you look at the left half of slide 10, you can see all the different fuel types. Active, again, is under study. There is one project, 291 megawatts of natural gas, that is under construction. Everything else in Delaware right this moment in the queue is still under study. So we'll have to kind of wait and see how much of that moves forward.
Where is that plant?
Where is that?
Do you recall? I didn't realize we had one under construction.
It could be an upgrade to an existing plant, and most of that's up at the very northern edge of the state. We have a lot of projects right now at that size, 291 megawatts. It would probably be an upgrade to one of the existing plants, but we can get you that information.
Is the understudy
That's where it says active. That's the 451 megawatts of natural gas on slide 10. That would all be in study still. And in particular, like the offshore wind, that's very much, you know, at the early in the study process. Those projects have unfortunately been in and out of our queue a bit over time. These are more current projects. There is a little bit of a debate as to whether these are Maryland projects or Delaware projects. The interconnection point is in Delaware, so if you look at our queue, it shows as Delaware generation. But I'll let you arm wrestle with Maryland as to who gets the energy.
Maryland's.
So long as you don't pay for it.
So is that gonna improve the LMP for us here in Delaware?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The energy will be injected at virtually zero cost. You know, the energy side, not the capacity side, but the energy side for wind is essentially a zero LMP injection, and it's just going to spread out on the peninsula. So that'll bring the LMP down on the peninsula whenever the wind is blowing.
Is nuclear a part of this slide 10?
It would be. There's no. There are no nuclear projects right now in Delaware. There's not a lot left in PJM at all, other than a few small upgrades. The last nuclear project in the queue was, I believe, North Anna, and that has recently, in the last year, dropped out of the queue. That's in Virginia. The last thing that we typically talk about in the capacity side of this are deactivations. There were 2 deactivations earlier in 2017. The McKee 1 and 2 units, 17 megawatts apiece. They deactivated the end of May of this year, and there are no pending deactivations currently in Delaware. If you want, we'll jump into the transmission. We can come back anytime if you have questions, we can jump back and forth.
So on slides number 16, in terms of the transmission, as Steve mentioned, there's not too much going on in terms of new issues that we've identified in Delaware in the 2017 RTEP. We are largely wrapping that up right now. There is one issue on a tie line between Delmarva and Pico Energy that still needs to be resolved. There's a number of alternatives that we're evaluating. They're smaller scope projects, and we would expect to have that wrapped up and be seeking endorsement of or approval of projects at our February board meetings for that. Beyond that, other projects that I thought I'd note that have been previously approved by the PJM board and are in various stages of implementation. The Artificial Island project is currently, all the different parties are currently doing engineering right now, designing their substations and facilities. LS Power, which is building the line under the Delaware River, is on track to submit for getting their permits from the Army Corps of Engineers. That's tentatively scheduled for end of 2018. The 230 kV cable that will be used is in type testing right now in Europe. So just a smaller section of the cable is actually under test currently. There are also just a smaller project. It was actually a market efficiency project that was put into the RTEP 2 years ago. Is expected to be placed in service by the end of this year. It's an upgrade to a 69 kV line. The Worcester to Ocean Pine 69 kV line will help to improve LMPs on the Delmarva Peninsula. Any questions about the baseline upgrades? The network upgrades on slide number 17. So these are upgrades that are required to interconnect new generation. And there are no new network upgrades for any of the projects that Steve mentioned earlier. Supplemental projects on slide number 18. So supplemental projects are projects that are being done by the transmission owners. They are not required to satisfy any PJM reliability or market efficiency or operational performance type of criteria. So they're essentially changes to the transmission system to address things like aging infrastructure or perhaps to interconnect new customers and things like that. There are a number of those types of projects that are ongoing on the peninsula, and they are primarily to address aging infrastructure facilities, 138 kV and 69 kV facilities. On slide number 19 is merchant transmission, and there are no transmission associated with any merchant transmission requests that we have right now in our interconnection queue.
Okay, I'll jump back to the load forecast. If you look at slide 21, this is the PJM load forecast, and we looked at this one last time. You know, we're seeing a pretty consistent trend every year lately of the load forecast dropping downward and out to the right. There's a lot of different issues at play here. One of the bigger ones is efficiency programs at all levels, commercial, industrial, residential. We also are tracking in PJM essentially behind the meter solar, residential solar installations that people are putting in. We have some pretty good research in terms of what vendors are doing, sales projections as well as installations. So we're developing a pretty good ability to forecast, at least over the next 3 to 5 years, what the likelihood of additional rooftop solar is going to look like, and that is continuing to flatten the load forecast. If you look at slide 22, again, this is the Delmarva Power and Light forecast, not specifically Delaware, but the entire peninsula. If you look out over 10 years, the load growth is actually very slightly negative in terms of summer peak load, just 0.1% negative. The PJM load forecast is very slightly positive, but only 0.2. If you look at winter peak, however, the Delmarva Peninsula is growing very slightly. So it's the load shape is flattening. The summer is coming down very slightly. The winter is growing very slightly. And, you know, we are seeing a flattening all across PJM. Even in the summertime where there is growth, we're seeing the load kind of spreading out, where we're seeing more weeks with similar load levels. Historically, we always used to see one peak week and the rest of the summer would be somewhat reduced. This phenomena, we believe, is related in large part to commercial and industrial customers essentially self-curtailing. They will guess when they think the peak load days are going to be, because their share of the capacity obligation is based on typically it's the 5 peak days of the summer. So if you're an industrial customer and you can guess, you know, the top 10 days and you curtail your service, even by moving a shift from the afternoon into the evening, you can dramatically reduce your share of the capacity obligation. What we're seeing is the peak loads are coming down but spreading out. So we're seeing more weeks with the similar load levels that are slightly lower than they have been in the past. We're trying to do some research to get some validation of that, reaching out to customers. We don't have a lot of relationships, obviously, with retail customers. We deal mostly in the wholesale, but we are trying to find out how to get better information. But that seems to be what's going on with our summer peak loads anyway.
I have a question with respect to how you measure that, because are you measuring peak before the netting of any solar contribution? For instance, you have a hot, sunny summer and you get a lot of solar generation. Are you measuring it net of the solar contribution or before?
We meter the load net of that, we try to estimate what that contribution would be. Obviously, it's an estimate, but we think we have a pretty good ability to do that. If there are any curtailments through operating procedures, we will add those back in to try to figure out what the connected load would have been. So we have a pretty good ability to recreate what the connected load would be. When we talk, though, about the peak load, we are talking about net of customer behavior. So to the extent that customers are self-curtailing or have behind-the-meter generation, we're looking at the net loads.
How many years out in advance do you forecast? I don't remember.
We do 15.
15?
The load forecast portion of that is, we've actually done a lot of work to improve that, but it is still highly dependent on, first of all, the econometrics, which, you know, if you go back to 2008, the econometric forecasts every year just keep coming down and down and down. The forecasts related to some of the consumer behaviors get pretty fuzzy. Like even the energy efficiency forecasts are probably pretty good at 5 years, less so at 10, and you know, even less at 15.
How about EVs? Are you starting to take them into account? Or?
We are starting to do research. There's not a lot of proliferation. Obviously, there you're looking more at charging behaviors after the peak. So we're more concerned about flattening the daily load, so that, you know, we may not see a lot of impact on the peak of the day, but the peak may become a much longer time period. Today, the peak runs, what, about maybe 4 hours, 3 hours, late in the afternoon into the early evening. If people are getting home and starting to charge up electric vehicles, that peak could extend outward well into the evening, into the night. So we're mainly in the research stage now.
Does PJM have any position with respect to how the individual states underneath PJM, served by PJM, how they do their rates for EVs?
No, I don't think we have any position on it. Obviously, we would like to be in a position to kind of work with you. You know, our ability to understand customer behaviors is going to make our jobs a lot easier from a planning perspective, from an operating perspective. So, you know, we would love to work more with all of the states to understand better, you know, what's going on with the customers.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to just supplement that question a little bit. So you have precious little historical information to base your projections or assumptions around EV charging, but might you anticipate fast charging having some impacts on the transmission, distribution, and peak load?
My gut is that if, to the extent that we start getting fast charging, for example, at the workplace, what you could have happening is kind of in the middle of the day, people have arrived at work, they plug in, they get a fast charge to get them home. So again, that hopefully would still miss the peak of the day, but it could extend. You know, you could now start to see a higher load level in the middle of the day, standard peak in the late afternoon, evening, and then a slow charge peak in the late evening. So what used to be, you know, one kind of hump in you know, in the 4 to 6:30, 7 o'clock time frame could be a series of 3 humps. It's probably not very scientific to describe it that way, but we're finding a pretty significant impact. Again, mostly after we realized the recovery wasn't coming after 2008, we spent a lot of time looking at efficiency behaviors. We're now starting to look at what might happen with storage, whether it's EV or people putting panels on the basement wall. You know, solar or any other fuel cells, any other behind-the-meter kind of residential resources. We want to get out ahead of those. Efficiency, I think arguably we were behind the curve on that one because after 2008, we kept thinking that the economy was going to come back, the load was going to come back, and it just kept getting pushed out and out and out. And in retrospect, that's when some of those efficiency behaviors were starting to kick in. And it was probably that we had already turned the knee before we realized that, so our research has been playing catch up. We want to get out ahead of some of these other behaviors. We have a little bit of information on markets, and if you've seen any of this earlier in the year, the capacity market information is from May, so it would not have changed. Slide 24 shows you the prices that cleared in the RPM auction back in May. Slide 25 shows you the specific details in terms of how many megawatts cleared for generation, demand response, and energy efficiency in Delaware.
Steve, what is the primary reason for the, the great discrepancy between where we're living and next door at 76.53, 86.04? Is that just the congestion on the peninsula?
No. No, it's not the peninsula congestion. That's, do you remember what the limitation?
Yeah, on slide number 24, the limits in the Eastern MAC were actually voltage problems on the PICO system and basically concurrently at a similar load level, a voltage problem on the PSE&G system. So it wasn't due to a limitation on anywhere on the peninsula. You know, I believe the primary reason for the difference in price is primarily due to the bid behavior. The amount of megawatts limiting, the amount of megawatts that we can move into the Eastern MAC area is well above the reliability criteria requirement, and I think it's based on, so the price differential is largely based on the differences in bids for the different resources in Eastern MAC.
Paul, did the Con Ed wheel changing in there have any impact on that?
As a comparison to prior years, that was one of the many changes that were incorporated into the updated models.
My understanding was that reduction in what was available prior from outside PJM had a significant role in the Eastern MAC separation.
Yeah, it had a role. You know, basically, once we removed the circulation portion, in order to optimize the imports into the east, we had to be able to manipulate some of the phase angle regulators on the PJM New York interface. So we were able to manage a lot of those problems, but as Paul said, we had somewhat simultaneous voltage problems in the north and in PS, as well as in the kind of southeast Pennsylvania area. So I don't think we ever quantified how much of the difference was related to the wheel as opposed to just hitting this kind of simultaneous limit all the way down to Delaware.
How much nuclear generation do we have to build in Delaware to offset that?
I'll have to get back to you on that one.
What's being done about those voltage issues?
The challenge is that it's not a reliability problem because, as Paul said, we're importing far more than the reliability criteria requires. So we did have some projects proposed economically based on the price separations, and we're still working our way through. The economic cycle is slightly different than the reliability cycle. It runs on a 24-month basis. So all of those projects were proposed earlier this year, and we're just wrapping up the analysis now and hope to have them to the board in the February timeframe. So we'll have to see what's able to clear based on benefit to cost ratio. I'll skip down to some of the LMP behaviors. The one I think is most instructive is on slide 30, which it shows you the average Delaware price compared to the average PJM price, and you will see that the Delaware price is just very slightly below the average PJM price. That's primarily a function of all the gas that's been built in the east now is creating congestion flowing somewhat westward and southward to Baltimore, Washington, Northern Virginia, those areas. So where you used to see congestion flowing west to east and the Delmarva Peninsula and New Jersey being elevated, you're now seeing in an energy perspective the opposite. So the prices are actually just slightly lower in the east than they are in the west. And then you can see that here on a 24-hour basis on slide 30. Slide 31 just gives you a sense of the energy production in Delaware. You still have a fairly substantial amount of energy imports, 27%. So back to your earlier question about, if we were to introduce 500 megawatts of wind, that would be a substantial, portion of your energy, on a round-the-clock basis. Even at a 50% capacity factor, that would be a substantial portion of your energy. The emissions slides actually are not updated yet. Those will not be updated till the end of the year. And I think we talked about these last year. This is largely a function of the coal retirements that we've talked about and the gas additions. So if you look at slides 33 and 34, that's what those reductions are largely based on.
Steve, excuse me, on slide number 31, where you talk about the amount of energy produced,
yes,
that's the share of the source from which the energy is coming, but out of this total picture, how much do we import as opposed to generate here?
Again, this is not based on ownership shares. This is based on physical location. So if a generator is in Delaware, it's 100% to Delaware. So what this is showing is that, around the clock for this period, November to October, you imported 27% of your energy.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, we have had this conversation, like with West Virginia, for example, where there are jointly owned units that are immediately across the state line, and West Virginia feels that they are, quote, entitled to half of the energy because the unit was built half for Virginia and half for West Virginia. We've not gotten to that level of sophistication with these charts yet. We're contemplating that, but I don't know that that would be an issue for Delaware anyway.
My recollection is around 9,000 megawatts that were import. Is that right?
I'd have to get that for you, Dallas.
That's okay.
I realize we went through the slides a little quickly. We want to make sure if you have questions on individual projects. Obviously, Paul walked you through where the engineering is on Artificial Island. Obviously, we're still waiting with bated breath to see if FERC takes up the issue that you have raised at Maryland. We now have 4 commissioners at FERC. May have 5 any moment. So obviously we're kind of waiting to see what happens there.
Well, once again, we'd like to extend our thanks to your organization for all the hard work on the engineering that gives us the 2 choices that are presently at FERC that FERC hopefully will consider.
Sure. And as we said, on a number of occasions, we will support that conversation. We have every expectation that FERC will take it up, and we intend to support the conversation.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
And I apologize for the long wait to get to this presentation. A little bit longer than I expected, to be honest with you, but that's just the way we operate. And
not a problem.
Your patience.
Absolutely.
So, Commissioner Gray, you had asked about projects and resources in the PJM footprint. I know we're sort of pushed for time, so that's something I can do later, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, Paul, Lori, appreciate it. As always, we appreciate your coming here and sharing with us what's going on at PJM, in particular the Delaware portion of what's going on. It's always a little teeny portion, but we still appreciate it. Chairman Winslow, Commissioners, I wanted to take some time today with you to talk about legislative proposals. We'd like to submit some legislative proposals to the legislature this 2018 session. And we have at least 3 pieces of legislation that are already in the General Assembly and will be moving forward, or hopefully moving forward in some way, shape, or form. We also have 11 other items that we would like to propose to you. Invariably, when we're attending a committee meeting, the committee often wants to know where the commission stands on legislation. And it's often very difficult for us to say anything because we can't take a position for you on legislation. So what I was trying to do here was to forestall some of that questioning and to perhaps give you all an opportunity to weigh in on where you would be with respect to the new legislative items. I figured you could just treat this just like a consent agenda, and you could just approve it all just as it stands. But then again, I thought, well, no, maybe there might be some questions that you might have, that you might want to take some of those items off the consent agenda and discuss those individually. So I'm open to however you would like to go through this listing of 14 different items.
I think it might be good to hear from whoever's at the table would like to speak on the issues. Sometimes we don't have the same mind with respect to legislation, which doesn't mean much necessarily. But anyway, Mr. Slater, do you have any comments?
I'll wait to see how it goes, but I do have comments on a few pieces of the legislation. Some are just simple additions for clarification, and so you don't have to do amendments later. I'll just do one. The second bullet says exempts all electric and gas charging services, and it probably should just say natural gas. Yes. It's up to your discretion on how you choose to proceed. I may have additional questions.
You chose to proceed by calling on you.
All right. Well, then I'll keep going. Thank you
Please.
for the opportunity. So we talk about distribution planning every 5 years for the electric utilities, but it's not for gas or water. I would suggest that it's up for all utilities. And then I had a question on the authorization for the low-income utility rate. We've heard Delmarva say numerous times they don't know who the low-income are. And while I would support any lower bill, I'm concerned as to how much that's going to cost Delmarva to put that together, and are we just spinning our wheels? And I'm a little concerned about what the average customer use is if we're using Delmarva's, I think 975, 944 number. 945. Yeah. So that was a concern. And then obviously with the misutility violations, I hope that we work with the Attorney General's office on that legislation, because I have a feeling that they're going to have some comments. And then the other legislative items.
They're going to want to know about it.
Yeah. And the other legislative items, we talked about the Delaware Conservancy watershed bill. They just emailed me earlier today. I haven't had time to get back to them yet. But I agree with staff that, I would be opposed to the bill. I know they came here and spoke before, but my opposition to the bill is that Delaware ratepayers are going to pay for a project in Pennsylvania where the Pennsylvania PUC has specifically said we want to see what Delaware does. And I find that wholly inappropriate for Pennsylvania not to clean up their own mess. And Delaware can then, help. But if they're not willing to take the first step, why should we take all the steps for them? And then the Reggie funds, I'm just going to hold that one. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Gosh. I made a comment. I wanted to ask you a question, but I can't think of it now. Oh, I know what I wanted to indicate and try to be as tactful as possible, and that is that over the last good number of years, for the pipeline safety project, I know that this commission has communicated through channels with the previous Attorney General, and I believe with the present Attorney General, and the communications have not been robust on the way back, so to speak. So hopefully, I'm sure that Mr. Howitt and Mr. Hardigan will be touching base with the Attorney General's office on this particular issue, but I do think that there's really a lot of improvement that could be made in terms of the pipeline safety area anyway, if we had a little bit more recognition of that issue from the Attorney General's office.
Mr. Chair, if I may, I would hope that the utilities would take a stance there too.
I would point out that none of these have gone anywhere in particular because I wanted to find out how the commission felt about some of these. As far as the misutility bill goes right now, the issue that has come up about our inability to comply with the enforcement requirements, the issue is pretty much a communications issue, and it's a communications issue in letting the enforcement authorities know where there are aggravated issues from dig-ins and stuff like that. So this is a different bill than we originally attempted to do. If you'll recall, probably 2 years ago, we talked about a shared enforcement. We left the enforcement statutes all alone. The enforcement statutes are basically with the Attorney General's office. And what this does is this just puts us in the loop and allows either us or the Attorney General's office to invoke a penalty that's payable to the general fund. So that's all this really does. And it requires the communication. So I'm sure Miss Utility Group will come in and they'll probably oppose it because they want all these detailed things in their legislation. But for us not to do anything means that in another 3 years we lose our funding, or we'll have a significant reduction in our funding on pipeline safety. So I think we have to take an action, and I think this is probably the easiest action to take with minimal change to the legislative statutes.
Well, I would just like to extend my, or our appreciation to Bob and his team on, this is probably the finest and best group of legislative initiatives I've seen on the table for our commission and since I've been around. And so I'd like to thank you for the hard work, and obviously we appreciate the input from the public advocate and whoever else might want to give us input with respect to the legislation. I'm not sure what you want us to do at this point in time. Perhaps we should entertain more. Should we entertain more input from?
Well, I mean, I can go through fairly quickly.
Mr. Chair, pardon me, Bob. I've actually looked and made a few notes. I can do it in 3 minutes if you'd like. I mean, if you want the feedback, I can provide you. Although I made notes very small, so if I can read them. On HB 127, I think, yes, I agree with the staff recommendation on the charging stations, you know, the more than 6 or the pressure on the pipelines. The only comment I have here noted is I think it's very important that charging stations is defined very carefully in some way, right? On the IRP, the Integrated Resource Planning, I think it was move it from 5 years, move from 2 years to 5.
It was moved, the IRP was moved from 2 years to as directed by the commission or when the supply changed for Delmarva.
Okay, a little uncomfortable with that because I think there's so much changing that could impact the distribution transmission network with transportation electrification. It might be better to incrementally move that. From, if you now have it at 2 years, move it to 3, and then consider moving it to a broader time frame after that.
This is principally about supply and where Delmarva gets their supply from. And right now, every time they have come in with an IRP, 100% of their supply is coming from the market.
Okay, if it's that narrowly defined in scope, because I read the summary, then I would agree with it because it's not having the impact that I had originally imagined.
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
The distribution planning that we were seeking at 5 years, every 5 years, in my mind, addresses the issue that you've raised and how things are changing dramatically.
Right.
And maybe that should be even a shorter period of time. I don't know, but at least we wanted to put something on the table that we thought that perhaps the utility companies might not oppose.
So I would agree. I would agree with the way you've presented that piece of legislation. The next item I had was rates under bonds. I agree, from 7 to 9 months, I think you said. Authorization for low-income utility rate, I would agree to. But I have a question. How do you benefit low income who pay utilities when bundled into rental payments? this is, I think, an issue that, you know, you've got layers that you need to get underneath of to reach the right people, unless you're going to give the landlords the benefit of a low utility rate. The supplier fuel mix reporting, okay, agree with changes. I assume this information would be available by way of PJM's website publicly, so I agree with that. The motor vehicle assessment, okay, I agree with that. Basic cable rates regulation, okay, I agree with that. You had something related to telecom filings, and everywhere in Delaware is competitive because they have mobile phones, wireless, but I question that some institutions take the prison, for example. Is that the case there also, and is there some nuanced oversight that the commission is giving up that they should retain? That's a question. That's the only issue that came up there. Misutility enforcement, I agree with that. The Delaware Conservancy, I agree with the public advocate. I agree with the staff's position. I really don't think Delaware should be saddled with the consequences out of PA. And diverting the RGGI funds, if they can be used for more education around efficiency, electric vehicles, solar, workplace, workforce development, things of that sort, I would disagree, but I don't know whether the statute allows that. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you for sharing that and appreciate the effort that you put into it.
Thank you. I think the statute with respect to RGGI permits the states to do a lot of different things with the funding, and in fact, some states like New York have historically robbed the RGGI funds. So we're just really following in New York footsteps in the current legislation, but I'm not sure I agree with that approach, but that's.
I'm trying very hard to fight my.
Well, you know,
Yeah, we think that's a very bad idea.
I appreciate Drew's comments about our neighbor state and the fact that Pennsylvania should pony up some money and take care of problems, but on the other hand, you gotta give some thought to the fact that if they don't, that means we continue to get problem water in Delaware. And I guess, how long do we wait? And also, if there's a business case that says we invest $100 and we get a $150 benefit, even though the problem might be Pennsylvania, at some point in time, don't you have to consider the fact that your people are trying to fish in or swim in or use waterways that are not clean? I don't know. I used to close my law office down twice a summer and do a canoe trip down the Brandywine River. I stopped doing it because it just wasn't safe for us people, human beings, to get in the river. Pretty sad.
But shouldn't that be, I mean, it's a statewide benefit.
Right.
So why should one utility's customers pay for all of it? Because right now, you're only looking at Suez Delaware's customers that would be paying for it.
Well, you know, I'm just talking in general. I'm not trying to get into the weeds.
No, and I'm
saying-
just playing devil's advocate,
Yeah.
right?
Mr. Chair, if I can, I used to spend a lot of time in the Brandywine growing up as well. I don't either, but
It didn't affect your height.
it didn't. It did not. It might have affected the hair on top of my head, though.
Glowing?
I am. I might be glowing at night. But to kind of go back on your point, I would agree that Delaware would have to do something. But if Pennsylvania doesn't do something with their nutrient management, or their PUC doesn't take some stance, then it's not going to matter, because Delaware can't clean up the entire mess on our own unless we're going to put it on the ratepayers of Suez only. And so I think I said it before when Richie and his group were here, I would implore the commission, and I know I would do it, to send a letter to Pennsylvania to say, hey, you know, we'll help, because obviously the water flows downstream, but for them to say we're waiting for Delaware to take an action is unacceptable.
Well, I think that your idea of communicating is a very good one.
I try.
I would think that's a terrific idea.
For the record, I grew up on the Brandywine also. It didn't affect my height or my hair, so you never know how genetically it's going to, it doesn't discriminate.
I grew up close to the Delaware River, and look how short I am.
Well, I grew up close to the Brandywine River, so, and I'm short.
Yes, sir, Mr. Howard.
I'm assuming that I may take from your discussion here that many of the proposals are okay as submitted, and that we have a few minor corrections and additions that were offered by the public advocate. And so I will take that as your position if asked in the hearing rooms.
I just have one quick question. How did the number 6 come up in terms of the electric vehicle charging stations to make a difference between requiring a CPCN and not? Where was that 6 number?
The 6 number was attempting to look at if you have 240 volts and you have 6 charging stations, it could get to have an impact on the distribution system of the company. You could go to 7, you could go to 8 if you'd like to. I mean, we could go back to 4. One of the issues that was raised by DENREC was that apparently the University of Delaware has a location with more than 6 charging stations, and they didn't want the University of Delaware to have to register and get a CPCN application for it. I could live with the number at 8, but the bottom line from DENREC was that they did not want to regulate any of this.
Right.
And so I'm left with an all or nothing, and I guess the 6 was the compromise. Tell me you'd like a different number?
I would like a different number.
Why don't you just grandfather anybody in prior to the legislation?
You could do that, you
And
could grandfather.
make the new legislation more than 6, because there could be 10, there could be 8 or 10, but more than 6. And if you're giving the power away for free, like Tesla does, then does that count as one? Because they're not selling power, they're giving it away.
Well,
just like,
the reason it's even out there for your consideration is because I believe you have a responsibility for a reliable distribution system, and I'm concerned that when you get up to 10 charging stations, a whole parking garage full of charging stations, that you have significant impacts on the distribution system. So I'm trying to draw that line as to where there's a significant impact on the distribution system and where we don't really care one way or the other.
It's hard.
What does Delmarva say about that?
Yeah.
Oh, you're gonna be sorry
Mr.
you asked.
Mr. Delmarva.
No, I was thinking the same thing. I think it's a good idea because we actually have a docket before you that's going to talk about some of those things. So I just don't know what the number is. So I was going to ask, would that be helpful to get our engineers together to help staff choose a number to recommend and what type of chargers, whether it's a direct charger or we can do that. We're willing to do that. We'd always like to do that. So if that would help, we'd be very happy.
Well,
we have a figure that as determined by the Public Service Commission?
Rather than a number 6, have it
Rather than number right now, a number to be determined.
To be determined.
Yeah.
I'd strongly favor that because I would imagine the answer is going to be variable depending on the circumstances and distribution system where you make the installation.
And of course, you're all aware that no matter what you take to the legislature, you may get something different.
Mr. Chair, if I may, Commissioner Drexler, you're right on the 6. I believe DENREC has 8 at the I-95 Welcome Center right now. I think Tesla has 4 there, and I think DENREC has 8.
The real issue for me on this was when you get to the DC fast chargers and you find out that one DC fast charger is the equivalent of 5 residential houses. You get 6 of them together, you got a whole community drawing off the distribution system.
Right, it's like trying to put a bowling ball through a garden hose. It's not that all that much is going to it, it's all going at once, and it could really stress the system, and that's sort of the things that will be addressed in the EV docket that's coming up. And so it's a really good point that staff is making. What is the level? And I love what you said about to be determined by the commission, because it might change, right?
Oh, yeah.
It might change from year to year as to what impacts it would have with the technology and how the system's built. So maybe you could have, say to be determined under regulations to be passed or something like that. But I love that idea. I think it's a really good one.
I hope it stays.
We will undertake to finalize those legislative proposals, and we will certainly circulate them to the parties that need to be involved in that process so that we're not attempting to blindside anybody. As you'll notice, it was on your public agenda. I certainly appreciate it. Thank you very much for your input.
Thank you, Mr. Howard.
Lastly, we have another commission meeting on December the 7th, 1 week from now. Just drop your Christmas presents off in my office. I'll be waiting anxiously for it. We also, at that meeting, have a regulation docket. I believe you might be familiar with Regulation Docket 56. And we will have a hearing at that meeting. So pack your overnight bags.
That's because they bring dinner.
Thank you.
And breakfast.
Okay, we're adjourned.
Commissioner Drexler, just at that.
You've heard the summons. You've heard the summons. You've heard the summons. You've heard the summons.